only person with 3 degrees in literature, so I definitely have a different training. I don't actually have a methodological training, as it turns out. What I've been trained to do is to study narratives very carefully, do close readings. That's basically what I do. And in the spirit of Federico's talk, I'm also here to address the problem, the kind of vexed, political and lived problem in Canada right now. The other thing is in English, we have this tradition that I'm a little bit, you might not be used to it, so I'm going to try not to do it too much, but we usually just read our papers at conferences, which will be excruciating for you if I do it, so I'll try to speak extemporaneously as much as possible, and I did get some pictures so that you wouldn't suffer as much. But I'm talking about, the women I'm talking about, both them and another man as well, are Indigenous people in Secwepemc territory in British Columbia, which is the most western province in Canada, and I'm not an Indigenous person, I'm a Settler-Colonial person, striving to be an ally, accomplice, and friend of Indigenous people, and I would say that I'm participating in research in which I have an unabashed ethical entanglement. Alexander Wendt calls this subject-object endogeneity, in which researchers may be members of the very system they're observing, and in anthropology and other social sciences, this kind of practice is discussed a lot. Whenever I talk about and present my research, I always have the practice, as I'm doing now, to acknowledge that I definitely benefit from my access to colonial power, and I can kind of move between the worlds of colonial sources of power and communities of Indigenous people as an ally and friend of some Indigenous people in Canada, and also I act as a middle-class white person in Canada as well, which is another benefit. And of course, this movement is not frictionless between Indigenous communities and middle-class white person community in Canada, but that's another topic. So I just want to kind of set that aside as a preamble. So what I'm doing today, what I'm aiming to do, and this is the beginning of a project that I've just started this year, is to intervene in the colonial machine, I would call it. It's a little bit crazy what I'm going to say, so I'm a little bit nervous, right? But I would call it the scaling, classifying, mapping, categorizing, reductionist colonial onto epistemology in the Canadian state right now. So I've been working towards a decolonial academic and personal practice for a number of years. In my last few papers, I've analyzed Canadian mining corporations and their rhetoric of environmental and economic disaster. When there's a disaster, they kind of take up that disaster to create themselves as the victims of the disasters that they themselves have created, and then to sort of reinvigorate their corporate projects with like an extra need to mine even more quickly. And I recently published a paper examining the role of impunity in Canadian corporate mining violences that are aided by the Canadian state in Canada and Central America, and especially I used Hannah Arendt's. Hannah Arendt has these models of the mechanisms of impunity in violent nation building. I'm sure most of you are aware of her analysis of totalitarianism, and Canada's reputation as a beautiful humanitarian nation is actually very helpful for these mechanisms of impunity for Canada, because you would never think Canada would do a bad thing, would you? So it's very helpful when people think that about you and you march into their country. So in any case, that's what I've been doing the past few years. And then this summer, I read Alexander Wendt's extremely controversial book. It's been exciting for me to see how his ideas are received or not received this weekend. But I read his book on applications of quantum models to social science. So I'm proposing insights into understanding colonization in Canada and the conflict. This is the problem, the conflict between the colonial state and the corporate actors of that colonial state and Indigenous communities. And I'm hoping by considering the Canadian state as a Newtonian model epistemology, I'm going to build this up a little bit, that maybe by taking the ideas of Alexander Wendt, I can work on the decolonization of the epistemology of the state. That's the idea. So these, especially his ideas of entanglement and superposition. Now, obviously, these phenomena are already always happening at the level of the state and in Indigenous communities. So I also just want to say too that first I have to introduce the political landscape of Canada, and that might take a little bit of time. So I'm not going to really get into everything today. I'd like to kind of finish early if I can, so that there's time for questions or suggestions. And really, also in humanities, we often, I don't know if you do it, we present papers that are just beginnings, sort of. So I'm happy to have suggestions so that I can make it better. I also draw from Canadian political scientists, Glenn Contard, and anthropologist Susan Strega, and one of the things they call for when you're looking at issues of social justice, especially when the researcher is kind of entangled, is to be careful to look upwards as much as possible towards the framework of the more powerful epistemology, when there's a set of unequal power relationships and unevenly powerful epistemologies. So it's very tempting to analyze Indigenous people as like romantic and kind of like particularly magical. I definitely am prey to that all the time, and it's much more difficult to analyze a very kind of boring, seemingly boring set of state epistemologies, but that's what I'm working towards as well. So I would call it that I'm working on a close read, because of my literary background, of the epistemological and ontological foundations of the more influential worldview in this relationship, which is the state and the corporations, especially in the last papers that I did mostly of that. So another thing that I think is important is to not talk about Indigenous people as just like a big kind of amorphous group of identical people, but as actual, people with names, which is why I want to start by introducing you to Jacinda. We'll left to right. That's Tina Sellers. Actually, the full last name is Tina Sellers-Ogden, and she's a Chiquitmec woman. Mostly lives on the reserve, which is like her community and the piece of little tiny chunk of land that the Canadian government has given her band. And then behind her is Marilyn Baptiste, who at that time was a chief of the Honeyquatine and the Silcotin Nation, which is another nation. And then Bev Sellers with the glasses and the pink shirt she was a lawyer and she has a degree in history, and now she works, they all work with an FN Warm, and she's also a best-selling author of a recent book about colonization in Canada. And then on the right, Jacinda Mack, who's also Bev Sellers' daughter, and has a master's in communication, and they all work quite a lot within this group called First Nations Women Advocating Responsible Mining. And Jacinda sent me this photo and said that it's her favorite because they're in Ottawa at the nation's capital, there to present their ideas and their words to the state. So I don't know if you know this, maybe you do, but Canada is in a truth and reconciliation process right now. So this process theoretically should include an openness to Indigenous narratives and Indigenous thought, Indigenous onto-epistemologies. There's a lot of listening that takes place in which Indigenous people come forward and present their narratives and their histories, and the state is meant to listen, or other people in Canada are meant to listen. However, what I found is that when it comes to Indigenous people's claims to occupying and living on and from particular land and waters, the state epistemology is inevitably rooted in an expectation that evidence will be solely discrete, that language is discrete and evidentiary, and that a conflict-based legal process most accurately and, importantly, most ethically decides who gets access to land and waters. So in this, I would definitely recognize the duplicity in practice, and also we can see that these habits are scalable across to global imperialism. So you might recognize this from other examples of imperialism around the world as well. Some of the first acts of colonialism in Canada show that this change in the epistemology and like putting forward a new knowledge model has always been very, one of the first things that happens. So I'm going to quote Glenn Contard, a political scientist. Some of the first acts of colonialism in Canada were to forcibly indoctrinate the Indigenous population to the principles of private property, possessive individualism, and menial wage work. So this was accomplished mostly through something called residential schools, which was a state-sponsored 100 years of kidnapping and forced education of Indigenous children, started in the 1860s, and the last ones closed in the early 1990s. Most of them ended around the 1970s in Canada. Children were forced to relocate sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. They were beaten if they spoke their language. They were starved. They were often physically and sexually assaulted. But Sellers went to residential school, and so did Tina, also went to residential school. That's the word book about it.
Norah, what is that? What kind of school?
They're called residential schools. Yeah. So many of the elders who are the people leading, the movement for Indigenous land claims are also dealing with the trauma of these schools. It's another really big topic, right? So that's the background, that's the problem, and then I read Alexander Wendt's work, and I thought there might be a way to address at least this kind of onto-epistemological problem, because I do feel like one of my opportunities as an academic in Canada is to look upwards at the state and try to do something decolonial. So in May of this last year, I attended a meeting. The United Nations Working Group on Business Ethics had a meeting in Secwepemc territory. The name of the territory is Secwepemc, and that is all these women live in that territory, actually. They came in particular because in 2014 there was a massive mining spill, one of the biggest spills in the world. 25 billion liters of mining waste spilled into a lake, and then that went into a really deep fjord lake, which then went into Cornell River, which then went into the Fraser River, which goes right through Vancouver, actually. So the waste included things like arsenic, lead, and selenium. The bioavailability is still not known, and bioavailability refers to the point at which it breaks down and animals can absorb it into their bodies, and then people eat those animals, right? That's a brief summary of one of the worst mining disasters ever, and many Indigenous people live on or right near this water. So these women, for example, and their families and communities, for a long time have lived from the food that comes from those watersheds, right? So the UNWG, the UN Working Group, they came to hear testimony. Actually, the call was quite open. It said they wanted to hear from local people about the effects of business on their communities. That's it. So, I mean, technically, people could have come forward and talked about, like, restaurants or, like, gas stations in their communities. But they didn't. The entire day was taken up by community members, not all Indigenous, some non-Indigenous community members, like farmers and fisher people and people who just lived there for a long time. They came forward, and they only had 10 minutes each, but it was off. It's like 10 hours, it's a full day of people testifying, talking about, all they talked about were the devastating effects of mining in their communities. And to be clear, this mine, there was never permission for this mine to go onto Indigenous territory. And in this part of Canada, in almost all of British Columbia, there are no treaties. So the idea that, I used to live in Europe, and I felt a lot of people had was that there was some sort of like official handshake and signing away and trading away of land. There was none of this in British Columbia in this area, right? Indigenous, it's active colonization. There was never any agreement. There's never been any treaty signed at all. So this is like, there's never been a treaty. The mine was not approved by Indigenous people, and now it's poisoned the watershed, and people came to talk about that. So, and what I thought was also interesting, which I would like to look at with Alexander Wendt's ideas, and I don't quite know how yet, is that Indigenous people, almost uniformly when they came forward, they said that they were grateful that they were not speaking to the Canadian state, because they felt that when they spoke, it was the traditional kind of communication was Indigenous people on one side of the room, representatives of the corporations, and the state on the other side of the room. And they felt that United Nations was kind of like a third objective party that would listen in a new way. It was a very hopeful space in that way. And the representatives were from different parts of the world, which also I think kind of gave them a little more credibility to the Indigenous people. So now I just get a break from my words a little bit. I'm gonna a few more images I want to show you. This is another beautiful, really beautiful picture of Jacinda. She's also half Newhawk. Newhawk is a First Nation on the coast by Bellapula. Oh wait, it didn't. Oh my God, it didn't work. It didn't work.
The up and the down.
I know it's working here, but it's not moving there. Oh, you can look. Thanks. Maybe I moved a plug or something. No, it's like maybe it's something here. This is working.
Yeah, no.
Oh, no. Oh, fuck.
Beautiful.
Yes, it was
Yeah. I know.
Or it's streaming.
I swear, it's the last panel.
No, that's for the camera. So.
Oh, you swear?
I think yes, the whole rolled up.
Oh, sorry.
Why doesn't it work?
No, I don't.
Also, this we don't understand this depth bit.
Yeah, but I'm not sure it has anything to do with that because look here.
It's like a hardware problem, maybe.
Because here
It's like moving on the screen, but not moving up there. Anyone?
Anyone? Can I help us? No.
yeah, I'm not what do you say?
I really need the next slide.
Okay, sorry. No. Where's the cursor now? Where's the cursor?
I see the cursor on the screen.
Oh, it's like the thing where you have to slide it over. Look, the cursor's there.
Yeah, but,
You know how you have to drag it over sometimes? Maybe it's...
If I now do this, what happens?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's on a split screen. probably.
Escape from that time?
How do you do the split screen?
Yeah, escape, hit escape.
No. Escape, yeah. But
And
not
then just usually go this and drag it over, right?
go this, what do you mean?
Like if you can grab this orange part and then just like pull it, sort of. Yeah, and then drag that over to the right off the screen completely. Yeah, right there. I got it actually. It's a little to the... Yeah, and then drag it over that way.
Yeah, but
You just have to look behind you. It's this weird thing where you have to be like this. Okay. Oh. I need to grab something.
not nothing except that one. So let me do it.
If anyone's more skilled.
Oh,
How did you got it? I don't know, but I think it's okay. It's gonna work. Perfect. Okay. This is one thing. Okay. This is another photo. Okay. Okay. I'll just move more quickly then. So this is another photo just in with salmon. They're actually fishing salmon right now, but they're salmon fishing through a lot of the year. Yeah. It's a major food source. Okay. Her mother, got salad. She's at the Fraser River there actually too. Okay. And this is really nice. She really likes this picture of Tina Sellers Ogden. Tina is Jacinda's auntie, and that's the yeah. Okay, we're gonna keep moving. This is the lake that I was talking about where the spill was. It's a fjord lake. It's one of the deepest fjord lakes in the world. This is the pictures of the spill that I was talking about, and in this one on the top, on the right there, you can kind of see the underground plume. Like this entire muddy gray area was completely green before, so the scale is I cannot really understand 25 billion liters. You know, I can't quite understand that, but you can see it a little bit here. So this, but I'll get sidetracked if I talk too much about the spill because it's quite horrible. So this is an excerpt of the testimony from Tina Sellers Ogden to the United Nations Working Group in May. I mean, this is a very English professor thing. If you'll forgive me, but I'm just going to read it out loud. I know you can read it, but the province will bluff you. It's not treaty we need. We don't need to go to a treaty. I had dreams about this lake, Quenelle Lake. I saw a big bonfire. I saw a killer whale circling me. I was on a peninsula. It is like Chernobyl to me. I can't see it. It is under the ground, in the air, in the water. You think I'm going to drink that water, eat that fish. They log to the timberline. They log every watershed there is. And mining is worse than that. I can't believe that. And they still keep us on reserves. The land is ours. Let's go there. My children are dying living on this reserve. If we are stewards, let's do it. This generation is all about money and material things. That's what it is. That's where it is. I'm choked. Salmon soup for the sick. We can't do that anymore. We are getting donated fish. We're still living in particle board houses on reserve. Okay. So she said more than this. This is just one small part. So I'm going to just kind of work through some of this, to the close read, the literary tradition, right? So she opens, although this is the first thing she said when she stepped forward to speak, is that she immediately rejected the treaty process. And she says that the government will lie to her. It's very colloquial, so in case you don't know the colloquialism, bluffing is lying when you know that you're lying. Wait, you know what I mean? It's an act. It's a very performative kind of a lie, right? So immediately she sets aside the kind of government, the process of the contract she sets aside, and she calls forth the vitality and life of the land. And she immediately speaks of a very unusual dream because her habitat is 600 kilometers from the habitat of killer whales. Whales are like, there's no killer whales, it's orcas, right? And her testimony then immediately moves to other topics, and she does not separate poverty. Particle board housing is like the worst. It's system. It shouldn't even be a house. It's like something for your car maybe, but it's very cold in the winter. A lack of fish for this traditional soup they give sick people. And she also, really quickly, also goes on to address the problems of materialism, of reification, of money, of logging, and mining. Anthropologist Strega, who I quoted earlier, talks about indigenous epistemologies that often describe knowledge as a relationship, which also Federica mentioned. Understanding connections between organisms, events, times, memories, and places is described as the beginning of knowledge. So another thing that often happens when elders, and she's an elder, will present their knowledge is they will, before she talks, she also first gave the names of all of her close family members and her ancestry, and will sometimes present the stories as the lineage of who has told them these stories and where they come from as well. Tina presents a spatial and temporal holism in which events and bodies are internally related and are mutually constitutive. The lack of fish and the poisoned river are kind of obviously causal, but poverty and sadness and living in particle-board houses are less so. They're not obviously causal with the mining spill. The generation being all about the money and the things rather than about soup for the sick and caring for rivers, I do think that this is a presentation of kind of constitutive acts, right? And when it talks about these, she doesn't really have to explain the relationships between them. She presents them in this way, right? I actually felt that she was very patient, and many of the elders are remarkably patient with the Newtonian Eurocentric epistemology and with poverty and environmentalism and fish soup and land are like really seen as discrete and quite unrelated. So what will also happen is an elder will present an idea, and that elder will be told, well, we're not talking about fish today. Like, you know, next week is the day we're talking about fish. You have to get out of here. You can only talk about housing. And so the attempt to describe an interconnected kind of scenario is completely rejected. So I'm going to just move ahead to another. This is so a few words from Bev Sellers. She said this actually in 2014, right after the spill, and then again in 2017. She says this almost every time she speaks. At that point, she said the salmon are coming up the river. She's talking about economics, and she speaks about the economics of her nation all the time. She says that the economy of the indigenous people walks on the land and is alive, and this is not a metaphor. I just want to say, as a literary person, the way people are using metaphor this week, it hasn't been a week, it's only been 2 days. But, you know, a metaphor exists because of a material thing. A metaphor does not exist in some sort of like non-material space, right? So when she says our economy swims and walks on the land, this is not a metaphor at all. Economics is not a metaphor. And then I also, because I know I don't have too much time, and I would like to leave time for questions, so I'm going to get to Chief Norah Bowman in a moment too. I've seen elders and indigenous women come forward with questions like, what about the hibernating animals? So there was a spill, and they said, in the spring, the hibernating animals will come to the river. What's going to happen? And the mining company actually said to the women, you know, we are sure that the bears will know about the spill. They're going to see that everything's different, and they probably won't walk through the arsenic, selenium, and lead. They would say our fish are sick. We can see that they're sick. They would say our families are suffering from addiction and poverty. They would say when the forest fires come and burn near the spills, what would happen? And in each of these cases, when the community speakers could clearly understand the entanglement between their suffering and the existence of all of the non-human organisms around them and the presence of the extractive mine, the mining company representatives would deny the relevance and the very existence of the testimony of the community members. So I also was very often the only person writing anything down in the room. So even people from the government would be there, and nobody would be writing anything down. It was as if their testimony completely didn't happen. I think I wanted to show you. Yeah, it's very short from Chief Darrell Bob. So I mean, he's not really. This is not a metaphor, you know. What the companies did was they sent out little cans of fish to the communities, little cans of fish from the grocery store. It's like the cheapest, but it's bright yellow and it just says salmon. This is not it. When he says that we will die, you know, he's really not kidding. Yeah, first and foremost, we have to protect the water, because without the water, we will always exist. And then I want to make sure you see the company website. Oh, you can't really read it. That's okay. I'll get, yeah. It says that research and monitoring has observed rapid recovery of the impacted environment. The rehabilitation work and monitoring of these areas is ongoing. So it immediately assumes ownership of the knowledge about the ecosystem. It assumes an objective observation and claims absolute measurement veracity from the position of the corporation. And the community members are basically not even given the respect of disagreement. There isn't even really an engagement. Their knowledge claims and their experience are brushed aside as irrelevant. Indigenous community knowledge is, as I mentioned, based on collective experience, and I would say that it's closer to an idea of subjectivity. It's knowledge produced outside of a hegemonic center, epistemology, and then that epistemology just deems it incredible. I mean, like, not credible in the sense of incredible. And that's when you see that it includes things like dreams, or, you know, an exhortation from an elder who's not alive anymore necessarily. And Alexander Wendt describes how the dominant epistemic position rejects subjectivity, because an argument that not just acknowledges but privileges consciousness as a basis for knowledge acquisition would be problematic on the grounds that it's not scientific, that subjectivity is just an effect of language, and that the subject is dead, and so on. I'm going to skip a whole bunch of this last part, actually, because I think what I'll just kind of move to are my questions that I'm really trying to understand, right? So I wonder if colonial actors and kind of groups of actors within the colonial and state epistemology could recognize that their own epistemologies and their own beliefs are also made of non-local and collective knowledge and are also entangled. Because obviously, when the corporation brings forward information, that information is from a set of researchers that they've never met, that also has a history and a collective source. And that maybe there would be a position, especially within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for a flatter ontological entanglement between colonial and colonized knowledges. I think that's all I want to say, because I would like to have room for questions.